Hi. Hope everyone's feeling awake and cheery. I don't think we have any talks in the morning where the speakers are going to say that the world's going to end and we are all going to die, so you'll just have to depend on coffee today. So our first speaker is Tom Gillis, a co-founder of Bracket Computing, where they look at delivering enterprise solutions driven by business needs, not hardware limitations. His talk is going to be on the future of cloud security and advanced virtualization. He's not able to join us today, so he'll be presenting via WebEx. So let's kick it off with Tom.
So thanks, everyone. So my name is Tom, and I'm a security guy. So I've been doing security for 20 years. Have founded a couple of companies. My second startup was a company called Ironport Systems. It was an email security appliance. We filtered spam, and we did a lot of work in machine learning to help a machine understand the difference between a real message and a spam message, which is actually a hard problem to solve because you have people on the other end of the wire that are trying to make their spam messages look like real messages. Ironport was acquired by Cisco in 2007, and then I ran the products division, the security products division for Cisco for about 5 years. So firewalls, IPSs, VPNs, etc. My new company is called Bracket Computing, and we have been focusing on using an advanced form of nested virtualization to create a new platform to deliver cybersecurity. And I'll talk a little bit about the problem that we see and some of the trends we see happening in the industry that are aligning around this. So the interesting thing from my perspective about security is that the motivation and the impact of a security breach or attack has been evolving over time. So 20 years ago, the original high-profile attacks, like the Melissa virus, the I love you virus, they were email-borne attacks. I don't know if people in the audience may be too young. You were in high school or grade school at that time. But these attacks were primarily driven around fame, notoriety. Like they didn't actually do anything. They were just a way for a hacker to get credibility. And so security was sort of a headache. But what we've seen is there's been an evolution where people have realized, hey, I can make a business out of this. And so some of the breaches we've seen at Home Depot, at Target, at Yahoo, Sony, the latest ones at Equifax, these have material business impact. There's a huge amount of fraud, credit card theft, intellectual property theft, and it has a very negative impact on the business, and there's very, very clear, measurable consequences. The CEO of Target lost his job because of a security breach. And that's made the whole nature of the business change. Can you hear okay? Is this working?
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah? Okay, good. But what I've always thought was, a material threat, and we're now seeing it, was a political motivation, where you have nation states that now have a motivation, to potentially impact the course of elections, right, or to blind an opponent's, air defense systems. And so as the impact of these attacks have increased so, exponentially, the resources going into the attackers have also increased exponentially. So we're now dealing with professional engineers with professional tool sets, and we see a verticalization of the industry where there are people that make exploits, there are people that make rootkits, there are people that make social engineering, and those are actually different organizations that work together to create an ecosystem for attacks. And I think one of the most interesting things about this is that the nature of the attacks themselves has changed. And so what do the attacks at HBO, the attacks at Equifax, the attacks at the DNC, what's the one thing they all have in common is persistence. These attacks the attackers are getting into the network and they're staying in the network for 3, 6, 9, sometimes 12 months. And the way they do that is they bury themselves into the operating system. And so even though everybody's running basic security measures, everybody's running antivirus tools, an attacker can embed themselves into the OS and can persist in a network for as much as a year. And that's the time that they need to sift through a complex organization to find a specific set of data. And so one of the things we're seeing now is that the vast majority of malware is becoming targeted, right? So signature-based solutions where you're saying, oh, I saw this before, therefore I need to stop it, are becoming much less relevant because you're seeing malware with a population of 1. And it's very, very difficult for enterprise organization to be able to detect and stop these attacks with a population of 1. And of course, the financial impact just continues to grow. Where we've been focusing is in the Linux world, because more and more we're seeing Linux as a new attack vector. Linux servers are generally, people think of them as being hardened and secure, but the reality of it is a Windows operating system has very, very sophisticated defenses built into the OS to prevent someone from taking root, whereas Linux generally doesn't. And so as we think about the attack chain, we make the assumption that software is, does now and always will have bugs. Even the software, my guy's right, it has bugs in it, which means that there are always going to be exploits. There's always going to be a way for someone to put a random pattern of bits in front of a web server, and it's going to create a buffer overflow. And so we just have to make the assumption that an attacker is going to get in the network. And so what we've been thinking about is, as we look at the kill chain, what are the other steps in the kill chain that an attacker is going to take to get to data exfiltration? So the attack chain goes, you start with a compromise, then you establish a foothold, which means you get your buffer overflow, you spawn a new process like create a shell, you start to modify your system files, you find a way to escalate your privileges and to become root. You can patch the system call table in the Linux OS, and now once you've done that, you're invisible. You can run an antivirus agent, but once you've patched the system call table, the attacker has popped the system and taken control, and then that they can use that as a beachhead to move laterally and to start probing other servers, doing port scans in the data center, and move from server to server until they finally get their data, which allows them to exfiltrate. And so this is where we've been focusing, is on these later parts of the attack chain and thinking about how can we protect and harden a server. So when that's the question, when the question is, how do you defend a server when the server can't defend itself, there's an opportunity to create a new form of virtualization. And so I'm sure you're all familiar with the architecture of a hypervisor. A hypervisor was originally designed to allow multiple operating systems to share a single set of hardware. And this was done at a time when hardware was expensive. And so data centers were built out of things that came in boxes. Server was a box, a firewall was a box, a security device, an IPS was a box, and you would cable all these boxes together using Ethernet. And so what we started looking at was, is there an evolution of virtualization technology that makes it more like an agent, but not an agent itself? And so what we've developed is a form of nested virtualization, which can run between the guest operating system and the hypervisor of the cloud underneath. So another form of nested virtualization, just for reference, would be a Docker container. So a container is a form of virtualization that sits on top of the runtime. Our virtualization is we call a metavisor. And the metavisor is designed to sit underneath the runtime, but on top of the hypervisor of the infrastructure. And this is a point where you can implement security controls, because the interface into the guest is a hypervisor interface, which is very, very simple. It just simply looks as a virtual CPU, a virtual memory controller, a virtual NIC, and a virtual storage controller. So those interfaces are very, very difficult, not impossible, but very, very difficult for an attacker to breach. That would be a PM exploit, which are rare and incredibly expensive. But by implementing the security controls at a virtualization or metavisor layer, even if an attacker gets root access to the server, they can't turn us off. Right? Not only can they not turn us off, we, as an agent outside of the OS, can observe the behavior of memory patterns in the OS, and we can see things that are happening that shouldn't be happening. So, one of the first things we do is we monitor all the various processes that are happening in the guest. And so we can identify legitimate processes like antivirus agents. So we can see this is ClamAV or AuditD or a Qualys agent. But in the case of Apache struts, what would happen is the web server would respond to a certain bit pattern that would create the buffer overflow and allow an attacker to create a shell. And this is something that we're watching the processes that are running and saying, hey, wait a second, you can't spawn a new process in a running server. So it's a little bit of common sense, but it's very difficult for the operating system to implement that control itself when there's a vulnerability in the code that allows that to happen. The second thing we can do is we look at in-memory exploits. Attacks like timeout pwn, stack smash will take a process that's running in memory and will change its privilege from being in user space to suddenly being in guest. And so when we see that happen, there's no legitimate reason why that should ever happen, and we can again stop that. Once an attacker gets into root, one of the first things they will do is they will try, in fact, actually every known rootkit in the Linux space uses the same technique of patching the system call table. By patching the system call table, now they can basically hide, right? So there's no way for them to be able, for antivirus agent to be able to see the processes that are running that are associated with this malware. So the popular rootkits that we see are KBeast and Phalanx 2, and by simply patching the system by preventing the patching of the system call table, we can make a Linux server immune to those rootkits. And so even if you find a buffer overflow in the Linux server, you're not able to establish root. And then the last piece is file immutability. And I think this is extremely interesting. The logic is really simple behind it, and that is executable code should allow to be read but not written to. And so there's a notion in the Linux community of trusted path execution where we can say, this is executable code that's coming from a known source. That's the only code that's going to execute. Configuration files should allow it to be read but not be modified nor executed. And then log files can be written to and read from, but they can never be executed. And so if you could delineate those three classes of files and then enforce those rules, it makes it very, very difficult. I never say impossible, but it's nearly impossible for an attacker to be able to modify the system files that are necessary for an attacker to achieve persistence. And so the majority of the attacks that we see out there are focusing on achieving persistence by modifying the configuration of the system so that if the system reboots, the malware will still be present. That's relatively easier to detect because you can scan the files. That's what antivirus agents do, is they will scan the files looking for anomalous code. The in-memory attacks, the privilege escalation, things like process hollowing, much, much more difficult to defend against because it's harder to an antivirus agent can't scan processes that are running in memory. And so the combination of the two is a very, very powerful technique that allows to effectively make a server much more immutable. The last area that we look at is we look at, so we monitor the traffic that's coming out of the guest and do basic firewalling, right? So you should have random ports connected to random ports in other servers. We use tag-based segmentation to determine which server can talk to which server. So we believe that micro-virtualization or nested virtualization is a fundamentally new approach to security and to data center design as a whole. As I mentioned, the movement towards containerization allows for a form of virtualization for the application. By actually doing a similar type of containerization into the runtime, we can make the runtime more and more immutable. And these two concepts go hand in hand. If you look at what the philosophy is behind a Docker containerized application, the idea is that you don't really know what's happening in the operating system. You don't have to have custom configurations of the OS because the container can move from one host to another. So in that philosophy or environment, we can make the runtime itself much more immutable. We believe that the trend is going to be towards moving towards immutable infrastructure, where things that are in production at the OS level should never be modified and can therefore be locked down in a way that even though there are going to be exploits and vulnerabilities in the application itself, you can't modify the running OS, and therefore the scope of the attack is greatly limited. So that's my little overview on virtualization. Can you still hear me okay? Hopefully this is working all right.
Yes, we're fine.
Okay. I'd probably take 5 minutes for any additional questions.
Okay. Hey, Tom, this is Jim Farney. I just wanted to follow up from our last time we met and ask you about the maturity of all the different VM porting that you've done and where you are there, and also I'll say the forensics capability that was getting added to the services as well.
Okay, Jim knows us well. Those are two very good questions. Let me show you for the group what he's talking about. So what we have built is a hypervisor proxy. The operating system is talking to the metavisor, and the metavisor is presenting itself to the OS as a Xen hypervisor. And so then metavisor needs to present itself to the hypervisor of the cloud underneath us. So we have to do porting work to support the various hypervisors. There are 4 major hypervisors in the world. There's ESX, which is VMware's hypervisor on-prem. There's KVM, which runs at Google and in many OpenStack. There's Xen, which is what Amazon is using, and there's Hyper-V. Jim, we currently support all major clouds and platforms, so the metavisor can run on a premise-based VMware environment, on an Amazon cloud, on a Google cloud, or on an Azure cloud. One of the other things that is very important here is performance, because this hypervisor is not living in the infrastructure, it's attached to the guest. So think of it as a little shim you attach to every operating system, and it takes 2% of the memory of the guest. But it's living in a different memory space because the metavisor boots first, and then it chain loads the guest OS up on top. So we've spent an enormous amount of time making it as small and light and fast as possible. And so where we are is about a 2% tax on memory. And then, we use the word single digit, so less than 10% impact on CPU performance and system I/O. Of course, your mileage may vary with performance. It depends on the nature of the operations, but that's generally where we land. Now, the other thing Jim asked about, and I didn't show in this presentation, but an important part of this whole approach is the ability to analyze what has happened. And so because we are a hypervisor, we are a memory controller. So we control memory pages in the guest OS. And when we see one of those events that I talked about, when we see a memory privilege escalation, an attempted patch on the system call table, a root shell being spawned, at the precise moment, at the clock cycle of that instruction being executed, we can pause the guest and take a memory dump. Jim, we've added to the forensics capability not just memory dump, but we have a ring buffer. This is a prototype, but we make a ring buffer copy of all the packets flowing in and out. So we can give you a kind of TiVo-like approach where we say, oh, here was an event that we know to be extremely high indicator of compromise. We took a memory dump of all the memory that was running that we could put in a format that could be digested by open source tools like I forget the name of the volatility. And then also here's a PCAP, packet capture, where you can scroll back 10, 15, 20 seconds and see the network traffic that led to the attack. So it allows you to identify the technique the attackers are using and also the source where the attack is coming from. That's fairly amazing because if anyone in the room has ever actually worked on forensics, it is very, very difficult to piece together, what happened during an attack. And here we basically act like a camera at a traffic light where if we see a car running the red light, we take a picture of the car, of the driver's license of the car, and a picture of the driver in the car. And so it makes a very, very deterministic starting point for an incident response team that's trying to investigate a breach.
Any other questions? No, so maybe I have one quick thing. So as I was listening, it seems like everything that you achieve is via memory interposition in a sense. So I imagine that for preventing modification to the system call table, you're relying on memory permissions at the level of the metavisors for the data, for the region that contains the symbol table, the page table?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the way it works is we actually, with every guest that boots, we map the critical parts of the OS in memory. And we map the various processes that are running, looking at the process ID table. And then if any process is attempting to modify or patch that memory, we actually deny that operation. So the operating system will mark the system call table as read-only, but when an attacker has root, the operating root can't stop root. So the operating system can't enforce a read-only. It's simply just like a, best effort. Like, thanks for telling me that was read-only. I'm going to modify those bits. We can actually enforce that the critical pieces are in fact read-only and they cannot be modified. And so it's incredibly effective because we don't care what the exploit is. Once we protect the system call table, that server cannot be rooted.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question in the back.
Hi, Tom. So basically you're saying this server guard protects for KVMs, correct?
This will protect any Linux server running on any major hypervisor.
Okay, because I guess my question was, if you have hardware boxes linked to the KVMs, will it protect the hardware boxes as well, or it's just confused here?
Well, what we're looking is we're ultimately the thing that you protect is the operating system. What's happening underneath the operating system, whether there's a KVM or an ESX or a Zen hypervisor, you don't care. The guest doesn't care. The guest doesn't know. There are some people that are trying to attack the hypervisor itself, and that is an extremely hard target because if you can break a hypervisor, you basically can break into anyone's account on Amazon. So that's called a VM exploit, where you're breaking out of the server and into the hypervisor. VM exploits do exist. They are incredibly difficult to achieve, and obviously hypervisors are patched very, very aggressively. I have a friend that works for the NSA, and he says to me when I explain all this, he's like, Tom, this is really cute, because every system is breakable, right? And for us, it's just a question of how much money it costs to break it. And so he talks about a VM exploit is tens of millions of dollars. Like you'll put a whole engineering team for years to try to find one exploit, and then that can easily be patched. So implementing security at the hypervisor layer is a very, very strong, not unbreakable, but like it is for all intents and purposes, like for most people in this room, that is a completely unbreakable place to put security because no matter what happens to the guest OS, you can't turn a hypervisor off. And the hypervisor is what sits between the OS and the bare metal.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's Tom.
Okay.
Let's just give a round of applause for Tom. So we have a very short 5-minute break. The next session starts at 9:40. It's titled How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love IoT. See you guys in 5 minutes.